I worked 12 years for the family business, but my dad gave it to my sister and her fiancé, then begged for help when they abandoned him. After over a decade of dedication to the family business, everything I thought I knew was shattered. One day, my father made a decision that changed everything. The business I had worked my whole life for was handed over to my sister and her fiancé, leaving me with nothing. But as I uncovered secrets that no one ever talked about, I realized this wasn't just a betrayal, it was much darker than I could ever have imagined. How could my own father do this? How far did the deception go? The truth was far worse than I expected. This is my story of betrayal, redemption, and the last hope to save what was left. Stay tuned to see how deep the lies really go. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was September 17, 2012, a Tuesday afternoon when I first walked into Carter & Sons Construction at the age of 24. My father, Jack Carter, was 52 at the time, tough, no nonsense, a man who had been through everything the construction world could throw at him. He had built Carter & Sons from the ground up, and everything he did, every penny he earned, every broken bone and scraped knee was for one purpose, to leave the business to me. He often said, "You'll inherit this when the time comes, son. It's all for you. Don't let it slip away." I never questioned it. Why would I? At that age, it was clear to me that the business was my future. My degree in business management had been my father's idea. "You're going to need it, Evan," he'd told me, ruffling my hair in that typical dad way. "The paperwork's not going to fill itself. I'll teach you the rest." And so I did. I followed him around like a shadow, learning everything I could about running a business. There was no shortcut. The hours were long, the work hard, but I didn't mind. I loved the idea of following in my dad's footsteps, taking over a company that had always been a part of my life. For 12 years, I poured everything into Carter & Sons. I was the first to arrive at the job site and the last to leave. I worked weekends. I worked holidays. I worked when my friends were out drinking at bars. Hell, I didn't even remember the last time I'd taken a real vacation. But none of that bothered me because this was what I was meant to do. Every time I hit a milestone, every project we completed, I thought that it would earn me more than just a pat on the back from Dad. But it never did. It was always, "Good job, son, but there's more to do." It wasn't until one evening in early 2019 that I started feeling something was off. It was a Wednesday night, and I was just finishing up some reports in the office when I noticed Sophie walking through the door of the main office, looking unusually dressed up, like she'd just come from a party. Sophie, my younger sister, was 28 years old at the time. Unlike me, she'd never been interested in construction. Her life had been a series of half-started ventures, failed art projects, short-lived blog attempts, and, most recently, some kind of wellness coaching that seemed to be more about Instagram selfies than actual work. I'd barely seen her in the office before, so her sudden appearance was strange. Sophie had always been the free spirit, the one who never stayed in one place too long, but this time was different. She wasn't just popping by to say hello, she was engaged in a serious conversation with Dad. They were sitting at the desk, heads close together, whispering about something. I couldn't quite catch the words, but I saw the look on their faces. There was a sense of intent behind their words. It wasn't just casual chatter. They were discussing something important. And the more I watched, the more it began to gnaw at me. I had always thought that when the time came, I would be the one to take over the company. I'd been working my tail off for years, putting in the hours, making the connections, and building the reputation that Carter & Sons had today. But that night, watching Sophie and Dad huddled together in that dimly lit office, something clicked in my gut. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew, deep down, that something was changing, and I didn't know if it was going to be good or bad for me. I didn't think much more of it that night. I was exhausted, and the clock was already pushing past 10 p.m. But as I drove home, my mind raced with questions. Why was Sophie suddenly showing interest? What was she talking to Dad about? Was it really just another one of her half-baked ideas, or was something bigger brewing? I had no idea at the time, but looking back, I can see that was the moment everything started to change. What I didn't know then was that Sophie was about to make the biggest power play of her life, and I was going to be the last one to find out. It was a Tuesday morning, November 12, 2019. The sun had barely crept through the blinds of my office as I sipped on my coffee, going through the numbers from last night's site reports. The hum of the office felt familiar, almost comforting, like any other day. But that morning would prove to be anything but ordinary. My phone buzzed, a text from my dad: "Come to the office when you get a chance. We need to talk." I didn't think much of it at first. We had talks about strategy, business, or sometimes just family matters. My dad, Jack Carter, was still very much in charge of everything at Carter and Sons, and my place was secure. Or so I thought. By the time I walked into his office at 10:45 a.m., the air felt thicker than usual. His office had always been a bit of a mess, papers stacked high, the smell of old wood, and the occasional coffee spill. But today, it was different. The desk was cleared off, and sitting on top of it was a large, official-looking contract. And on that contract? My sister's name. Sophie. I hadn't even noticed my father right away. He was slouched in his chair, looking older than his 59 years, almost like the weight of the world had landed on his shoulders. His usual strong posture was gone, replaced with a defeated slump. His face was pale, almost drained, and there was no spark in his eyes, the kind I'd always seen growing up when he spoke of the company. "Evan," he began in a dry, almost lifeless tone, "I've decided to hand over the company to Sophie and Mark." The words hung in the air like a cold breeze. Sophie? Mark? The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on me. My stomach twisted, a cold knot settling in my gut. This couldn't be real. My mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, but none of them made sense. I just stared at him, hoping he'd crack a smile, tell me it was some sort of joke. But he didn't. "You're what?" I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, rubbing his temples as if the words were physically painful. "Sophie and Mark are taking over. It's time to move forward, Evan." I stood there, frozen, my heart sinking with every passing second. The room felt suffocating. This wasn't supposed to happen. I'd been there for everything. From day one, I had sacrificed everything for this company. Nights spent at the office, weekends missed, relationships ruined, all to make sure Carter and Sons grew into what it was today. And now, after 12 years, he was just handing it off to Sophie. Mark, her fiancé, was a joke. A flashy guy, no substance to him at all. He had no real skills. Mark was the kind of guy who spent money on designer suits, always had the latest gadgets, but couldn't even balance a checkbook. The last time I'd talked to him, he'd barely managed to say more than a few words about leveraging assets, while staring at his reflection in his phone screen. He had a history of bad decisions in business and relationships. He was everything Dad had warned me about. And now, Dad was handing him the keys to the kingdom? I took a step forward, trying to stay composed, but I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "What do you mean, move forward? I've worked my ass off for this. I've been here day in and day out, this was supposed to be my future." The words came out sharp, and I didn't care. Dad didn't look at me. He just shrugged, his eyes avoiding mine. "They have big plans, Evan. More than you can see right now. You're too tied to the old ways. It's time for new blood, new ideas." I felt my blood boil. New blood? Sophie doesn't even know how to run a business. She's never been interested. And Mark? You've seen what kind of decisions he makes. My voice cracked as I spoke, but I couldn't stop. Dad finally looked up at me. There was no anger in his eyes, just resignation. "It's already decided, son. They're the future." I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were caving in. I had been the one to build this. My heart, my sweat, my hours spent on construction sites, all to make sure Carter and Sons wasn't just a business, but a legacy. And now, it was being thrown away for a couple of opportunists who had no idea what they were doing. I took a step back, my legs feeling weak beneath me. "You're throwing me out, just like that?" Dad didn't respond. He just turned his gaze back to the papers on the desk, avoiding me completely. The room was spinning. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But it was. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just losing the company. I was losing the family I thought I knew. It's November 14th, 2019, and the weight of my father's words still hangs in the air like a cloud I can't shake. 2 days had passed since the shock of the announcement that Sophie and Mark were taking over Carter and Sons. I had barely managed to sleep, and when I did, the nightmares of losing everything were so vivid, I could still feel the anxiety waking me up at 3 a.m. with cold sweat soaking through my sheets. I had to figure out why this was happening, why he was doing this to me. Dad had always been straightforward, no nonsense. But now, he was avoiding me, barely making eye contact. I knew something wasn't right, something was being hidden. And I was going to find out what. It was a Friday afternoon when I finally cracked it. I was going through Dad's office, trying to get some sense of the situation. He wasn't there, probably at some lunch with Sophie and Mark, talking about new plans for the company. The place was eerily quiet, and I just felt this compulsion to go through his stuff. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was desperation. I started by sorting through the cluttered desk drawers. There were some old project blueprints, receipts from when we remodeled the office, nothing unusual at first. But then, in the bottom drawer, behind some old tax forms, I found a manila folder. It wasn't labeled, just a plain folder that seemed too hidden for something so innocent. My heart started to race as I opened it. Inside were documents that I wasn't supposed to see. There was a contract, dated 3 months ago, between my father and a business consulting firm. The first page of the contract was standard, terms of agreement, fees, but it was the second page that made my stomach drop. The figures in front of me were staggering. The document was essentially a loan agreement, but it wasn't just any loan. My father had taken out a massive loan in the company's name, agreeing to give away control of Carter and Sons to Sophie and Mark in exchange for a financial injection that would clear his personal debts. I flipped through the pages quickly, and my eyes widened as I saw more details. The amount of money they had given him was obscene, enough to cover debts I had no idea existed. There were debts for gambling, high-interest loans, and even some shady deals I didn't want to think about. It was all coming together now. My father had sold Carter and Sons to Sophie and Mark, not because they were the future of the company, but because they were a means for him to pay off his hidden debts. He had sold his soul and, in the process, sold mine too. The anger hit me like a freight train. I stormed out of the office, my mind a whirlwind of betrayal, confusion, and rage. I had been blind to all of this. My father wasn't just trying to move the business forward, as he had claimed, he was trying to secure his own future, at the cost of everything I had worked for. The company wasn't a legacy anymore. It was a pawn, a tool to settle debts he had kept hidden from us for years. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I marched to his office, my hands shaking with fury. I slammed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dad!" I shouted, almost choking on my words. "You sold the company? You betrayed me for money?" He was sitting at his desk, but the moment I spoke, he visibly shrank. He didn't look at me. His eyes were focused on the desk, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge. "Evan, it's not like that," he murmured, almost pleading. I'm trying to secure your future. I thought I could handle it, but..." "No, Dad." I interrupted, my voice rising with every word. "You didn't secure my future, you sold it. You sold everything we've worked for to pay off your gambling debts. Do you think I don't know what this is? Sophie and Mark, they're just pawns in your game." My father looked away, his face flushed. His lips trembled as if he was going to say something, but no words came. Finally, his gaze met mine, and there were tears in his eyes. Not the angry, defensive tears of a man trying to cover up a lie, but the defeated tears of someone who had allowed greed to blind them. He was ashamed. He should be. "It's not like that, Evan," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to burden you with all of this. I thought I could fix it myself, but the debts were too much. I thought, maybe this way, we could start fresh. I'm doing this for you." I felt like I had been hit in the chest with a sledgehammer. Everything I thought I knew about my father, his principles, his integrity, had been shattered. All those years I had worked, sacrificed, and believed in him, it was all for nothing. This wasn't a father trying to pass down a legacy. This was a man trying to escape the consequences of his own actions, throwing me to the wolves in the process. And Sophie and Mark? They weren't his heirs. They were his rescue plan. They were the key to his escape. I stood there, speechless, as the reality of it all sank in. My father had made his choice. And it wasn't me. It's December 9th, 2019. The frost had already settled on the windows of the office when I received the call. My heart sank before I even answered the phone. I knew something was wrong. The tone in my assistant's voice made it clear. "Evan, it's bad. We've got a situation. You need to get down here now." I could barely hold the phone steady as I ran through the scenarios in my head. What had happened? Another delay on a project? A complaint from a contractor? I had no idea that the very foundation of everything I had worked for was about to collapse. I rushed to the site, my mind racing the whole way. When I arrived, it was chaos. Workers were standing around, phones in hand, some of them trying to get answers, others just shaking their heads. The scene was surreal, like something out of a disaster movie. There were barricades up, yellow tape all over, and the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. The place was officially shut down. I walked up to one of the foremen, trying to get some sense of what had happened. "What's going on?" I asked, barely able to hide the frustration in my voice. He was pale, and it was clear he didn't know how to explain. "The project, it collapsed. A major structural failure. We had a whole section fall apart. No one's hurt, thank God, but it's bad. Real bad." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a minor mistake. A part of the building had literally collapsed. A massive, multi-million-dollar project, a project that had taken months of planning, was now a total disaster. I immediately went to the site manager, hoping to find out what went wrong. But the more I dug, the more the reality set in. There were too many corners cut. The building materials weren't up to code. The workers weren't properly trained. And worse, the design had been altered without proper oversight. It was a cascade of errors, all of which came down to one thing: negligence. As I stood there, trying to process everything, I realized something else. Sophie and Mark were nowhere to be found. It had been days since they were last seen at the site. In fact, they had flown to Paris just a few days earlier, as though nothing had happened. They were on vacation while the company was falling apart. I couldn't believe it. They weren't even trying to manage the situation. They had just run away. At that moment, I was done. I tried to get in touch with them, but my calls went straight to voicemail. It was clear they had no interest in dealing with the mess they had created. I had spent 12 years of my life making this company successful, and now it was all being destroyed by a couple of people who didn't care about the consequences. The media picked up on the story almost immediately. Headlines started rolling in, one more damning than the last. Carter & Sons construction site collapses, negligence or carelessness? The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Clients, contractors, even former employees started reaching out, asking what the hell had happened. Every conversation I had was a reminder of how quickly things had spiraled out of control. And then came the withdrawals. Contractors started pulling out of projects, citing concerns over the safety of the company's work. Clients began terminating contracts, refusing to do business with a company that was so obviously falling apart. Even suppliers who had worked with us for years were cutting ties. I sat in my office late that night, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop as I reviewed the growing list of cancellations. My stomach churned as I watched the company's reputation disintegrate before my eyes. Sophie and Mark had been given everything. The business, the assets, the legacy, but they had no clue how to run it. They had no backbone, no understanding of the stakes. And now, it was all crumbling like a house of cards. I tried to reach my father, but when he finally answered the phone, his voice was weak, as if he was in shock. "Evan, what's going on?" "I've been hearing rumors." I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to talk to him. This wasn't about rumors anymore. It was about a company on the brink of disaster, and there was no one left to save it but me. As the days passed, the collapse of Carter and Sons became more than just a series of bad decisions. It became a full-blown catastrophe, a corporate funeral. Contractors pulled out, clients abandoned us, and the media kept hammering on. I had tried to warn them, tried to step in, but Sophie and Mark were too busy living their new life to care about the destruction they were leaving in their wake. I had never felt so helpless. The company that I had poured my heart into was being destroyed by incompetence and greed. And worst of all, I couldn't do anything to stop it. It was December 16, 2019, and I was sitting at the local dive bar, nursing a whiskey on the rocks. The ice had long since melted, but I didn't care. I was trying to process everything: the collapse of the company, the loss of the legacy, the betrayal by my own family. My mind was a fog of frustration, disappointment, and disbelief. I had poured over 12 years of my life into Carter and Sons, and now it felt like I was watching it all burn to the ground. The dim lighting of the bar did nothing to ease the weight pressing on my chest. I stared at the amber liquid swirling in my glass, the bitter taste of failure on my tongue. My phone buzzed on the table. I wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone, not even my closest friends who had been calling to check in. But when I saw the name on the screen, Dad, I hesitated. I hadn't heard from him in days. After the disaster with Sophie and Mark, he'd gone silent, lost in the mess they'd left behind. The last time we spoke, he'd sounded distant, detached. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was something else. But I didn't expect him to be calling me tonight, not after everything that had happened. I picked up the phone with a sigh, barely holding it to my ear as I mumbled, "Yeah?" "Evan," my dad's voice came through, broken, barely a whisper. "Please. I need your help. They've abandoned me." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat up straight, suddenly aware of how much tension was in the air. My hand tightened around the glass, the coldness of it doing nothing to ease the heat rising in my chest. I could barely understand what he was saying next. "Sophie and Mark, they took the company's funds, and they're gone. They've left me with nothing. I can't fix this on my own." My dad's voice cracked, and it took everything in me not to throw my phone across the room. This wasn't the father I knew. This wasn't the man who had built an empire, the same man who always told me that we had to fight for what was ours. Now, he was pleading for help like a child who had lost his way. I couldn't process it. I didn't want to. "Why should I help you, Dad?" I finally said, my voice cold and bitter. "You handed everything over to Sophie and Mark. You betrayed me. You betrayed everything we worked for. How could you do that?" There was a long pause. I could hear my dad breathing heavily on the other end of the line. I thought he was going to hang up. But then, in the most broken voice I've ever heard, he said, "I was wrong, Evan. I know I was wrong. But I need your forgiveness. Please. The company's in ruins. I don't know where else to turn." His words hung in the air like an unbearable weight. I felt a swirl of anger, betrayal, and a deep, hollow sense of abandonment. This wasn't just a business deal gone wrong, this was my father throwing me aside, and now he was asking for my help. I took a long drink from my glass, the whiskey burning down my throat as I tried to keep my emotions in check. My father's desperation wasn't lost on me, but it didn't erase the hurt. 12 years I had sacrificed for him, for the company, and for the future that was now crumbling to dust. And now, after all of it, I was supposed to just let him back in? But despite everything, the anger, the sense of betrayal, I felt something else tugging at me. Maybe it was the man who had raised me, the man who had promised me the company. Maybe it was the fact that he was now completely broken, and I was the only one left who could help him. I couldn't deny that I felt torn. "Fine," I said finally, my voice thick with frustration. "I'll meet you tomorrow. But this is the last time, Dad. The last time." I hung up without waiting for a response, my hands shaking as I set the phone down. I couldn't believe it. I had agreed to help him. After everything. But what choice did I have? The business was gone. My future was gone. And in that moment, it felt like I was the only person left who could salvage whatever was left of it. I took another drink, the burn of faint distraction from the whirlwind of thoughts racing in my mind. It was December 17, 2019. The morning had barely begun, but I had already been awake for hours, lost in thought. I had agreed to meet my father the previous night, but I had no idea what I was walking into. After all that had happened, I didn't know if I was ready to face him. Or the ruins of what had once been my family's legacy. When I arrived at the office, the scene was exactly as I had feared. The usual hum of activity was gone. It was eerily silent. I pushed open the front door, and the first thing that hit me was the smell, a mix of stale cigarette smoke, alcohol, and something else that I couldn't quite place. The office, once a place of pride, was now in utter disarray. Papers were strewn across the floor, and empty bottles of whiskey were scattered like confetti. My father was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at the screen of his computer, which was showing a broken email inbox filled with ignored notifications. His unshaven face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. He didn't even look up when I walked in. I cleared my throat. "Dad, we need to talk." He slowly turned around, his face devoid of any expression. "Evan. I'm sorry. I know it's a mess here, but I've been trying to fix things." His voice cracked as if he was on the verge of tears. But what I saw was more than just a messy office. It was a reflection of a man who had lost everything, his integrity, his control, and most heartbreakingly, his ability to stand tall. He wasn't the same man I had admired for so many years. But that wasn't even the worst part. As I walked past the desk, trying to keep my composure, something caught my eye, a dark, weathered manila folder tucked behind a stack of paperwork on the corner of the desk. It was out of place, as if it didn't belong with the other documents. My gut twisted. I knew something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that this file held the key to everything I had been questioning. I picked it up carefully, flipping it open. The first page was a list of names I didn't recognize: construction suppliers, contractors, people who had worked with the company over the years. But then, I saw the word bribe scrawled across a column. My heart skipped a beat. I flipped through the pages, growing increasingly disturbed. There, among the supplier invoices, were references to kickbacks, large sums of money sent under the table to secure contracts. The more I read, the worse it got. There were handwritten notes about illegal deals, subpar materials used in major projects, and hidden payments that went straight into Mark's personal account. But the most gut-wrenching discovery came on the last page. It was a series of transactions marked as off-the-books payments, clearly used to cover up the company's shady dealings. And at the bottom, there was a name, one I didn't expect to see: Sophie. It hit me like a freight train. Sophie, my sister, had been involved in these illegal deals. My own flesh and blood was wrapped up in this mess. She had been complicit in the very actions that were destroying the business. And my father? He had known about it all along and turned a blind eye. I felt sick. Betrayed. Not just by Sophie and Mark, but by my own father, who had let this happen. He had allowed his own family to destroy everything we had built, all in the name of greed and shortcuts. I slammed the folder shut, my hands trembling. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I couldn't breathe. I turned to face my father, who was now looking at me with empty eyes. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "How could you let this happen? How could you let them get away with this?" He didn't respond right away. He just looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the shame in his eyes. "I didn't know it would get this bad, Evan. I never thought. I thought I was protecting you. I thought this was the way to fix everything." His words felt hollow. He had allowed the business to become a breeding ground for corruption, and I couldn't understand why. Was he so desperate to save face that he ignored the truth? Or had he been blind to the darkness that had taken over? I felt like I had entered a whole new world, a dark, horrifying underworld I never knew existed. This wasn't just about a failed business, this was about my family selling their souls to save themselves. And now, it was too late to fix it. It was December 24th, 2019, a day that should have felt festive, but instead felt like I was walking through a fog. I had just uncovered the full extent of the damage to the company, financial mismanagement, illegal activity, and a family willing to turn their backs on everything to escape responsibility. I knew I couldn't just let Carter and Sons crumble, but honestly, I wasn't sure I even wanted to save it anymore. After everything, it felt like the company was as much of a lost cause as the family that had once stood behind it. But I didn't have much of a choice. The business was mine to rebuild now, even if the idea of continuing felt like a hollow pursuit. If I didn't act, everything would be gone for good. I made the decision to fight back, to rebuild Carter and Sons, though it wasn't going to happen alone. I started making calls. It was late that night when I reached out to a few of my trusted former colleagues. Men and women who had been with me through the better parts of the company's history, people who had stuck around despite the shifting tides. I offered them parts of the company in exchange for their loyalty, knowing that if we worked together, we might salvage what was left of Carter and Sons. We worked through the night, sifting through contracts, fixing financials, and cleaning up the mess that Sophie and Mark had left behind. There were so many pieces to pick up, so many people to call back. By the end of that week, we had already secured a few new contracts and restored some credibility. But the entire time, in the back of my mind, was the painful realization that my father had nothing to do with this. He was nowhere to be found. I'd tried to talk to him, but every time I mentioned Sophie and Mark, he deflected. "They were just stressed out, Evan. You're overreacting," he'd say. It was clear now that he wasn't going to face the truth. He had checked out, hiding behind his own denial, too consumed with protecting his own guilt to see what had really happened. The father I had once looked up to was no longer there. The family I thought I knew, the one I thought I was fighting for, was gone. It was just me now, holding the shattered pieces of Carter and Sons. And I wasn't sure I even cared to put it back together anymore. Months passed. By March 2020, Carter and Sons had somehow stabilized. We had salvaged some projects and even managed to earn a few new clients. But every step forward felt like a weight I couldn't shake. And then, out of nowhere, I received an invitation to a family dinner. A part of me didn't want to go. But another part of me needed to see where things stood, if only for closure. So, on March 17th, I walked into my father's house, feeling the cold air of that old, familiar space. Sophie and Mark were already there. They acted as though nothing had happened. Sophie, wearing her usual bright smile, spoke as if she was still the center of everything. She mentioned buying a new property, as though their disappearance and the destruction they caused hadn't even been a thing. Mark, of course, was dressed in his designer suit, his smug grin never leaving his face. The same man who had single-handedly driven Carter and Sons into the ground now sat there, acting like a victim. "We had to leave for our mental health," he said. "You can't blame us for needing a fresh start." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These were the same people who had stolen from the company, taken off to Paris, and left my father in the wreckage. And now, they were playing the role of the victims? It was as if nothing had changed. They hadn't learned a thing. And my father? He was still under their spell, nodding along to their nonsense. His eyes were glassy, distant, as though he couldn't even see what was happening right in front of him. I looked at him, and for a moment, I wondered if the man I knew, my real father, had ever truly existed. As I sat there, listening to their excuses and watching my father's passive approval, the full weight of it hit me. Nothing had changed. The company was still in the hands of those who had ruined it. And I had spent months picking up the pieces for them, only to watch them waltz back in, expecting everything to go back to normal. In the end, it wasn't just the company that had been destroyed, it was the family itself. The loyalty had vanished. The betrayal was permanent. And no matter how much I tried to rebuild, the lies would never be erased.